What is the subject in Lacanian psychoanalysis? This is a somewhat challenging topic because how Lacan broaches and understands and articulates the notion of the subject is counterintuitive, to say the least. It is also an exercise a critical exercise in helping us think very differently about a series of concepts that seem to automatically accrue to the notion of the subject, as it is often portrayed in post-structural theory, but also a critical exercise in as much as it enables us to think differently and try to think differently about many of the concepts and understandings we have in psychology about something like an ego, something like a self. If there's one starting postulate that we can offer as a way of introducing this, which is the first in a series of 4 talks on the topic of the subject in Lacan, it would be this, and that is to say the subject is not, which is the title I've given this talk, the subject is not an ego. The subject is not an object. So with those 2 introductory comments in mind, let's begin. I will be drawing on the final chapter, I think it's the 6th chapter in this book of mine, the 6 Moments in Lacan, which discusses Lacan's critique and often quite devastating criticisms of the discipline of psychology. As we'll see, that context is quite important to how he's going to think about the subject. So let's begin then. The subject for Lacan, in one of his very earliest discussions of the topic, is that which is beyond objectivation. Beyond objectivation. We see this trend of thought happening a great deal in the first 2 of Lacan's seminars, where there's a lot of commentary, particularly seminar 2, on the subject as being something which does not fit within the categories, the conceptual categories of the object. There's multiple ways we can think about how the subject is beyond objectivation, but one of those ideas is to say that the ongoing ethical mandate for psychoanalysis is to not think of the subject as somehow reducible to the categories of an object. Whether we're thinking here object as in object of knowledge, or whether we're thinking object as in the human psychological entity which can be objectified. Lacan is allergic to both of those understandings. So our first understanding is the subject is that which is beyond objectivation. It does not fit within the conceptual categories that pertain to the object. The Lacanian subject is something that seems to defy the very parameters of this notion of a psychological entity, a psychological object of sorts. Now, if we want to get a little bit of background to that, we could make reference to some of the comments that Jacques-Alain Miller makes. He contextualizes this non-object status of the Lacanian subject with reference to phenomenology. Lacan, he says, Jacques-Alain Miller says, transfers the phenomenological view of consciousness, which is never an object, but rather is the vehicle through which certain objects become apparent. He transfers this understanding to the concept of the subject, which is again another philosophical way of saying that the subject in Lacan is by definition not an object, not objectal, object with an AL on the end, as is often described in the literature. This is an anti-objectivist view of the subject, and it's something that remains consistent throughout Lacan's work. The subject is decidedly not a thing. It seems closer to some kind of truth event, a linguistic moment, an instance of enunciation. And we've noted that the subject is beyond the parameters of the object, but we should also stress here that thinking the category or the understanding of the subject for Lacanian psychoanalysis is massively important because it is linked to the overarching agendas, the clinical impetus that underlies psychoanalysis as a whole. In other words, the importance of thinking what a subject is, or indeed might be, is linked to the aims of psychoanalysis, because the aim of clinical psychoanalysis could be framed as precisely the realization of the subject. So there's a wonderful quote that I want to just introduce. It comes from Leonardo Rodriguez, who is a Lacanian analyst, And he makes this point. He says, the aim of analysis is the realization of the subject. This is only possible in speech, in the utterance of the truthful word. I'm quoting him directly here. He says, the subject constitutes him or herself in and as what he or she says. In talking aloud, the subject does not simply learn about what is said there. More importantly, the operation itself is constitutive of him or herself as a subject. Now, there's a lot of ideas being expressed there, and again, many of them are counterintuitive, but let's just highlight this idea. The subject is realized in speech, in speaking, in symbolic activity. Or, as Rodriguez puts it, the subject is realized in and as speech. He doesn't use this formula, but I like this. In other words, the subject is a kind of speech event. So immediately, we're starting to get a sense here of one of the many ways in which how Lacan thinks the subject is very different to how we would think the subject in post-structuralism, for example, where we have this notion of subject positions, which seems to be another way of thinking about social identities, how we are located in certain social identities. It's also very different from the Foucauldian notion of the subject who can be subjected to power and who expresses and enables and speaks themselves, produces their own subjectivity. Here, and maybe this is the takeaway for our first talk, the subject is something that only emerges in the symbolic activities of speech, of language. It is a kind of speech event. Going back to Rodriguez, the subject constitutes themselves in and as what they say. So we could say then that this idea of the subject is absolutely about what is produced, what is done through linguistic operations. This idea of the subject does not pertain, does not exist outside the remit, outside the realm of enunciative, expressive acts. Now let's just make an important proviso here. Sometimes we have in political theory an attempt to take categories from Lacan and apply them elsewhere. Lacan is not doing philosophical work. This is not an attempt to ground and develop an ontology of the subject, a philosophy of the subject. Rather, this concept is one way that Lacan is trying to enable us to think what can be done within psychoanalysis. It's a distinctively psychoanalytic subject. Distinctively psychoanalytic approach, conceptualization. So what I'm meaning by that is that's the necessary frame, the necessary context through which we should approach this conceptualization. Or differently put, we need to understand what he wants to do with this concept, and we also, I suppose, should make this caveat, and that's to say, this is not necessarily a conceptualization that one wants to or needs to import to philosophy, to political theory, to any number of other disciplines. Maybe one could try and do that, but the way the subject is being approached here, precisely as an event enabled via the speaking processes of language, is very much about how to do clinical psychoanalytic work. So just to make that point, one shouldn't necessarily feel that one has to now understand or apply this notion of the subject throughout various facets of human behavior and human subjectivity. This one last point about Rodriguez's quote. More importantly, and I include it in the 6th chapter of this book, the operation itself is constitutive of him or herself as a subject. So we've got this paradox. The subject is realized in their speech, in their speaking, in their enunciation, their symbolic enactments. They are realized in them, but they're also, as it were, the speaking entity who is doing that stuff. Sounds like a bit of a contradiction. How is it that they are constituted, realized in something that they are already doing? That contradiction is kind of irritating, but in a way that contradiction is the point. The subject, you might be able to say, is precisely our inability to make sense of. It is precisely, as I put here, a kind of non-matchup, not Lacanian phrase, Derrick phrase, a non-matchup of statement and enunciation. So you'll remember, I'm guessing, that there are moments in early Lacan where he says, in any basic speaking situation, you can say that there is a non-matchup between the enunciative act of me speaking, of conveying something, of speech acting something, and the statement. Those two things never completely match up. The statement, the actual thing that is said, and how it is said, how it is heard, there's always a minimal gap between those two things. And inasmuch as there's a minimal gap, an irreconcilability, a split within those things, we have a split within the very moment of speaking. And that split itself is one way of thinking about the subject. So just to reiterate that point, if the split itself is the subject, it's not that you had a subject who makes a speech act and it doesn't all kind of fit together, statement and enunciation don't fit together. Rather, that already implies that there was some kind of cohesive subject prior to that. The idea is that the subject is precisely that incompatibility, that non-matchup, as it is produced. The very fact of splittingness itself, you could say, is the subject. So it's useful here, I think, to draw on a nice passage in this somewhat old book now by Malcolm Bowie. It was one of actually the first really useful texts, introductory text in English, published. It looks like, oh, I don't know when it was first published, but these days you could say there's a whole lot more of Lacanian literature. Why do we turn to this? It may be seen to be a little bit dated, but I think it has some very useful formulations. So, building on this idea that the subject is the split, and building on the idea of the non-matchup of statement and enunciation, let's see what Bowie has to say about the Lacanian subject. This is on page 76 of his book Lacan, and he says, when we're approaching the Lacanian concept of the subject, we're thinking about an empty subject. An empty subject. The subject, here's the direct quote, is no longer a substance endowed with qualities, or a fixed shape possessing dimensions, or a container awaiting the multifarious contents that experience provides. It is a series of events within language, a procession of terms, tropes, and inflections. Okay, let's stop there and comment on it before continuing the quote. Those qualifications, the subject is not a substance, okay? Of course, there's a long, developed, detailed philosophical history of thinking the subject as a kind of substance, as something endowed with characteristics. And this is precisely not what the Lacanian conceptualization of the subject is trying to think about. What else does Bowie say? The subject is no longer a substance endowed with qualities. It's not a fixed shape that possesses dimensions, and it's not a container awaiting for multifarious contents that experience provides. Not a container, not a substance, and not a fixed shape. So by now, you're probably getting the sense that the further we go, we're able to say a lot more about what the subject is not than what the subject is. That may sound like an odd way of approaching it because we're doing a kind of negative definitional work, and you may say, oh, this is a cop-out, tell us what the subject is rather than spending all this time saying what the subject is not. But as we build, one will start to get a sense that it is precisely the point, the psychoanalytical point, to dwell here in the negative. And I'll try and substantiate that as we move on. Let's start to draw to a conclusion. I just want to add 2 more points from Bowie before we bring this first short talk to an end. The subject for Lacan must be understood in terms of the notion of the signifier. And Bowie repeats this famous kind of catchphrase of Lacan's, a signifier is that which represents the subject for another signifier. Now I know this is a kind of statement that induces brain freeze, but let's just take 2 parts of it. A signifier is that which represents the subject. I like that because instead of having the subject is that which uses signifiers, we have the signifier, words, signifiers coming first, being prioritized for Lacan. It's not that the subject comes first and signifiers are of secondary importance, rather signifiers are of primary importance and the subject is somehow produced around them. So there's that destabilization, that interesting decentralization of the subject. But of course, it's not just that decentralization, destabilization, whereby the subject is now secondary to the primacy of the signifier, we also have the move where, here's the famous definition from Lacan, a signifier is that which represents the subject for another signifier. So it's not that we have a signifier which represents the subject to another subject. It's, and this is the kind of double or the second level of deprioritization, decentralization. We've got a signifier that's prioritized as that which represents the subject, and not directly to another subject, but to another signifier. That deserves a whole lecture all on its own, but let's just say a couple of things. The notion of the signifier, language, symbolic interaction, symbolic activity is once again being prioritized. The subject, in a sense, is deprioritized relative to those activities. So that's the one crucial point. Then Bowie goes on to give this rather odd description. He says, and I kind of like this because it's kind of odd, just as the hen is an egg's way of producing another egg, so the characteristic sensations of being a person or having a personality come from the self-perpetuating imperative that propels the signifying chain. In other words, certain psychological effects, like having a personality or being a person, those are not elements that are inherent within subjectivity in and of itself, rather they are produced by the play of language, by the play of the signifier. Two more sentences. Lacan's jargon of signification, Lacan's constant reference to the domain of signifiers, language, has as its most conspicuous advantage that of removing minds and mental processes or apparatuses from the scene. The signifier and its cognates cover the entire field that has previously been designated mental. So we will conclude our first lecture, mini-lecture, with this point. One of the ways that we will necessarily need to think about what the subject is in Lacan is always as secondary to an interplay of signifiers, firstly, and secondly, once that has been insisted upon, often in a way that Lacan is constantly going on about this, and sometimes, frankly, gets a little tiresome, but he's constantly going on about this in a way which is also disqualifying psychological concepts as a way of understanding what the subject is. Right? We remember the line in Bowie, this is not about personality, or so on and so forth. So one of the crucial ideas we'll have to take into our second lecture is this idea, this insistence that somehow the whole entirety of psychological discourse, the discipline of psychology, is getting something fundamentally wrong in how they approach the subject.